this video, I'm going to be reviewing Matty Matheson A Cookbook by Matty Matheson. If you don't know Matty Matheson, he's a Canadian chef and internet personality. He's famous for being on Vice's TV show It's Supper Time. I found him through the YouTube algorithm. I mean, this big fat white guy screaming at me and telling me how to cook came up on my feed, so I've watched a lot of his YouTube videos. He was born in St. John's, New Brunswick, Canada, and went to Humberg's cooking program in Toronto, where he actually never finished school and dropped out about 3 weeks before his class was done. He was the executive chef at Parts and Labor, but Parts and Labor closed in January 2019. So right now he's just opening up pop-ups and just kind of doing stuff here and there. Matty Matheson's kind of famous for being kind of like the edgy millennial chef who drops a lot of F-bombs and has a lot of tattoos, but can make really good food. He actually had a history of substance abuse, using cocaine in the 11th grade, and he had stopped taking drugs because at 29 he had a heart attack. He has a very interesting life story. I would recommend listening to the Joe Rogan podcast with Matty Matheson. You can learn a lot about him through this and his personality and his antics. That's of course if you like Joe Rogan. So anyway, let's get into the cookbook. He claims that this book is about what he cooks at home and not what he cooked at the restaurant. So a lot of these recipes are kind of for home cooking. This book doesn't really have a theme to it. It's more of a memoir. It's very similar to the LA Sun cookbook I reviewed, where it's a memoir on the chef's life, and these recipes kind of reflect points in their life. In the beginning, he talks about his life in Prince Edward Island. So there's a lot of seafood recipes, Canadian recipes, meat, potatoes, lobster. I think the beginning is where the book shines the most. It goes a lot over homey recipes and recipes that are very approachable. Some of these recipes are kind of daunting though, with large ingredients lists and huge instructions, but it seems like a fun challenge. Like, it's one of those recipes that disguised as an event for your family. In this book, recipes aren't split up into categories like other books. It's just kind of sections in his life and the recipes that follow. It can be kind of confusing because if you want to make a dessert, you don't really know where to go. You have to flip through the book first to figure out what you want. Some recipes can be kind of lengthy, like the seafood chowder recipe is quite long. I wish it was broken up a little bit so you knew what you had to cook concurrently. Each recipe starts off with a large personal story on Matty and why he enjoys this recipe. I think an issue I have with the writing is he describes every recipe as his favorite, the best. This is my dad's favorite, this is my mom's favorite. It seems like he always overhypes each recipe, which kind of shows his personality and it's being very eccentric and loud. But it gets kind of tedious. He just uses the same words over and over and over. I wish there was a little more depth into the history of the dishes. There are some good tips in this book, like on cooking seafood. I'm not familiar with cooking seafood and I did learn a lot. I wish though that he clarified a few things. In his lobster recipe, he tells you to cook the lobster, but he doesn't mention how to kill it or if you should boil it alive or get it pre-killed. He just says get these lobsters. As someone who never really cooks lobster, I wish he just clarified that. One thing I really appreciate about this book is a lot of the ingredients are measured in weight. I love cookbooks that do this. It makes everything way more accurate and reproducible. Oh, and this does pass the chicken temperature test because he says to cook a turkey breast until the breast is 145. So good job, Matty. I wish in the introduction of this book there was a list of essential tools that you would need. He calls for a terrine mold for the beef tongue recipe, which people might not have, and it just kind of pops up in the middle of the recipe. It doesn't stay in the beginning of the recipe, it doesn't stay in the beginning of the book. So it feels a little bit sloppy. Another example of a tool that he uses that's not really used anywhere is a ronco. He just brings it up in his prime rib recipe as if a ronco is a really familiar tool for home chefs. The difference in recipes in this book is really weird. There'll be some recipes where it's just get blueberries and make cream and eat that together and that's dessert. Or then there's the seafood chowder, which is like 20 ingredients and there's this huge list of everything. So there's this huge disparity between very simple and overly complicated. Another example of recipes being kind of sloppy, in the lobster bisque recipe, I wish he mentioned to make the bisque base during the lobster stock preparation. There's a lot of long cook times, but he doesn't lay them out so you're cooking them concurrently. Another issue I have with this book is sometimes he includes complicated ingredients but doesn't tell you how to make it. He mentions demi-glace, but he doesn't tell you how to make demi-glace. Demi-glace is kind of difficult to make, and if he had his own demi-glace recipe, I would have really appreciated that. There is some humor in this book I really like. He just mentions that anyone can get in culinary school if you have the money. A lot of chefs pretend like getting in the CIA or these big fancy culinary schools is a big achievement, when in reality, the acceptance rate is pretty high. It's just you need the money because they're so dang expensive. I'm not trying to downplay chefs. I think graduating culinary school is extremely difficult compared to just getting in. Once you get out of the Canadian seafood recipes and the more homey recipes, where we get into French cooking where he learned in his school, and then also the restaurant food, I find it less interesting. It's a lot more complicated and there's a lot of ingredients that the home chef might not have, like escargot or venison or wild game. It's an interesting cookbook to read the recipes and learn some things. As a home chef, it's very difficult to get these meats, so it's not very practical. Honestly, I probably won't make a majority of these recipes. There's some ones like the French onion soup or the lobster bisque. Some of these are just overly complicated, have some very specific meats that might not be worth getting. I do find Matty's humor in this book and his personality oozing through it. So if you're a really big fan of Matty, then you can pick up this book and learn a lot about his life and his cooking style and his recipes. I'm usually not a big fan of life excerpts in books because they generally focus a little bit too much on themselves when I'm really interested in the history of recipes and the history of ingredients. But with this book, I did enjoy reading some of his comments. He's got a great and funny personality. It's not very corny. I do think he kind of drops the F-bombs too much. In my opinion, it's not great writing just to put in curse words and it's not that funny. But that's fine. It's more of a me problem. Overall, I did enjoy this book. If you're a fan of Matty, then I recommend getting it. I just wish he stuck to a more consistent theme. Like if he had a cookbook dedicated to early recipes of his childhood, like a lot of seafood and Eastern Canadian food, I would have really appreciated that. Once it gets into the French food, I feel like there's so many cookbooks out there that discuss French food, it kind of made me lose interest. I'm not as enthusiastic about this book because I try to rate books based on if it's good for a home chef or if it teaches a sense of history or technique. But this book does everything like that, but not as well. Because of these points, I'm giving this book a 7 out of 10, but it's closer to a 6 than an 8.